She never expected her life to take such a drastic turn. What began as a simple family gathering would unravel the deepest emotions she never knew existed. The forbidden connection she felt was something she couldn't control, and when the truth came out, it wasn't just hearts that were shattered, it was lives. The weight of her secret was heavy, but nothing could prepare her for what her husband did when he found out. The look in his eyes said it all. It wasn't anger, it wasn't betrayal. It was something far more unexpected, something that left her breathless and questioning everything she thought she knew. No one could have predicted the path her life would take after that moment. What happens next will leave you stunned and make you wonder, how far would you go for love? And what price are you willing to pay for it? The deafening crack of a champagne bottle shattering on the hardwood floor pierced through the ambient chatter of the Thanksgiving gathering. All eyes turned to Emily, her trembling hands now empty, staring at the growing puddle of expensive bubbly at her feet. For a fleeting moment, the world stood still. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the sudden hush that had fallen over the room. Emily's cheeks flushed crimson as she bent down to pick up the broken glass, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Ryan, her brother-in-law, appeared by her side. "Hey, don't worry about it," he said softly, gently taking her hand to stop her from touching the sharp edges. "Let me get that for you." Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, a universe of unspoken emotions passed between them. Emily felt her heart skip a beat, a familiar yet forbidden sensation she'd been fighting for months. As Ryan carefully cleaned up the mess, Emily's gaze drifted across the room to where her husband, David, stood engrossed in conversation with his colleagues. He hadn't even noticed the commotion. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. When was the last time David had truly seen her? The Johnson family Thanksgiving party, hosted in their sprawling suburban home just outside Boston, had always been a grand affair. But this year it felt suffocating. The laughter seemed hollow, the smiles plastic, and the air thick with unspoken tensions. Emily excused herself, slipping away from the crowd and finding refuge on the back porch. The crisp November air bit at her skin, but she welcomed the sting. It was the first real thing she'd felt in months. She didn't hear the door open behind her, but she sensed Ryan's presence before he spoke. "You okay?" he asked, draping his jacket over her shoulders. Emily turned to face him, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know anymore, Ryan. I don't know." Without a word, Ryan pulled her into an embrace. It was meant to be comforting, brotherly even, but the moment their bodies touched, electricity coursed through them both. Emily buried her face in his chest, inhaling his scent, a mixture of pine and something uniquely him. She felt safe, understood, alive. For a fleeting moment, Emily allowed herself to imagine a different life. One where she'd met Ryan first, where the ring on her finger bore his promise instead of David's. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Ryan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We can't." She pulled back slightly, looking up into his eyes. The pain she saw there mirrored her own. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But sometimes I wish." The words hung in the air between them, unfinished yet understood. They both knew the devastating power of that wish, the lives it could destroy, the family it could tear apart. Inside, the party continued, oblivious to the storm brewing on the porch. Through the window, Emily caught a glimpse of David, laughing at something one of his friends had said. He looked happy, carefree. When was the last time he'd laughed like that with her? "He doesn't see me anymore," Emily found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "It's like I'm invisible, Ryan. We live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, but we might as well be strangers." Ryan's grip on her tightened slightly. "Have you tried talking to him?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Talking? David's too busy climbing the corporate ladder to notice I'm drowning. And when he is home, it's like he's looking through me, not at me." She paused, wiping away a stray tear. "But you see me, Ryan. You always have." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. They both knew they were treading dangerous waters, teetering on the edge of a precipice from which there was no return. Ryan took a step back, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit Emily had always found endearing. "Emily, we can't do this. David's my brother. You're my sister-in-law. We have to find a way to—" But his words were cut short as the back door swung open. David stood there, his expression unreadable. "There you two are," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Everyone's wondering where the hostess disappeared to." Emily quickly wiped away her tears, forcing a smile. "Sorry, honey. I just needed some fresh air. Ryan was kind enough to keep me company." David's gaze flickered between them, and for a heart-stopping moment, Emily feared he had overheard their conversation. But then he simply nodded, holding out his hand to her. "Well, come on back inside. Aunt Martha's asking for you." As Emily took her husband's hand, she couldn't help but notice how cold it felt compared to the warmth of Ryan's embrace. She glanced back at Ryan one last time before following David inside, and the look they shared spoke volumes. It was a look of longing, of regret, of a love that could never be. And as Emily plastered on a smile and rejoined the party, she knew in her heart that nothing would ever be the same again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Emily played the role of the perfect hostess, laughing at jokes she didn't hear, nodding at conversations she wasn't following. But her mind kept drifting back to that moment on the porch, to the feeling of Ryan's arms around her, to the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. As the last of the guests trickled out, Emily found herself alone in the kitchen, mechanically loading dishes into the dishwasher. The house felt too big, too empty, echoing with the ghosts of laughter and conversation from earlier. "Need a hand?" Ryan's voice startled her, and a plate slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly in the sink. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," he said, moving to help her with the cleanup. They worked in silence for a few moments, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we going to do, Ryan?" He sighed heavily, leaning against the counter. "I don't know, Em. I wish I had an answer, but I don't. All I know is that what I feel for you, it's real, and it's tearing me apart." Emily's heart raced at his confession. It was the first time either of them had openly acknowledged the depth of their feelings. She wanted to rush into his arms, to tell him that she felt the same, that they could figure it out together. But the gold band on her finger felt like a shackle, reminding her of the vows she had made. "Where's David?" Ryan asked, glancing towards the living room. "Passed out on the couch," Emily replied, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "Too much turkey and whiskey, I guess." Ryan nodded, understanding the unspoken words. David's drinking had become more frequent lately, another wedge driving them apart. "Emily," Ryan said, taking a step closer to her, I think I need to distance myself for a while. It's not fair to any of us to keep pretending everything's normal when it's not." His words hit her like a physical blow. Emily felt her world crumbling around her. "Ryan, please, I need you. You're the only thing keeping me sane in all of this." Tears streamed down her face as Ryan pulled her into another embrace. This time, there was no pretense of brotherly affection. It was the embrace of two people desperately in love, knowing they can never be together. "I love you, Emily," Ryan whispered into her hair. "God help me, but I do, and that's why I have to go. We can't destroy David's life or our family because of our feelings." Emily clung to him, her body racked with silent sobs. She knew he was right, but it didn't make the pain any less acute. As they stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, holding each other as if their lives depended on it, neither of them noticed the shadow that briefly passed across the doorway. David, awakened by their voices, had risen to investigate. He stood just out of sight, listening to the exchange between his wife and his brother, his heart shattering into a million pieces. As he silently retreated to the living room, the weight of this newfound knowledge settled over him like a suffocating blanket. In that moment, as Emily and Ryan reluctantly pulled apart, wiping away tears and straightening their clothes, the seeds of tragedy were sown. None of them could have predicted the storm that was about to engulf their lives, or the shocking decision that David would make when confronted with the truth of his wife's feelings for his brother. As Ryan left that night, casting one last longing look at Emily, the air was heavy with unspoken promises and heartbreaking goodbyes. Emily watched him drive away, feeling as though a vital part of herself was leaving with him. She turned back to the house, her beautiful, empty house, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Little did she know, the true test of their love, loyalty, and family bonds was yet to come. The stage was set for a drama that would shake the very foundations of their lives, leaving them all forever changed. The harsh winter sun filtered through the frosted windows of Emily's cozy suburban home, casting long shadows across the living room. It had been 3 months since that fateful Thanksgiving night, and the weight of her impossible secret hung heavy in the air, suffocating her with each passing day. Emily sat curled up on the window seat, a forgotten novel lying open on her lap, her gaze fixed on the pristine snow-covered lawn outside. The picturesque scene felt like a cruel joke, a perfect facade hiding the turmoil within. Her phone buzzed, and her heart leaped into her throat. It was a text from Ryan. "We need to talk. Meet me at Riverside Park in an hour." Her fingers trembled as she typed out a quick reply, "I'll be there." As Emily bundled up against the biting February cold, her mind raced with possibilities. Ryan had been true to his word, distancing himself since Thanksgiving. Their interactions had been limited to polite small talk at family gatherings, each stolen glance a dagger to her heart. What could he want to discuss now? The drive to Riverside Park felt both interminable and all too short. As Emily pulled into the parking lot, she spotted Ryan's familiar figure standing by the frozen river, his breath visible in the frigid air. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was to come. "Hey!" Ryan said softly as she approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and resolve. "Hi!" Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between them palpable. Finally, Ryan spoke. "Emily, I can't do this anymore. The distance, the pretending, it's killing me." Emily's heart raced. Was he saying what she thought he was? Hope, dangerous and exhilarating, bloomed in her chest. "What are you saying, Ryan?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. He turned to face her fully, his expression a mask of anguish and determination. "I'm saying that I love you, Emily. I've tried to fight it, to bury it, but I can't. And I think you feel the same way." The words hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and fraught with consequence. Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes, a maelstrom of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Ryan, she began, her voice cracking. "Yes, God help me, but yes, I love you too." The admission, finally spoken aloud, felt both liberating and terrifying. Ryan closed the distance between them, cupping her face in his gloved hands. For a moment, the world faded away, and it was just the two of them, lost in each other's eyes. But reality came crashing back as Ryan's phone rang, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen and his face paled. "It's David," he said, his voice tight. Emily stepped back, guilt washing over her like a tidal wave. David, her husband, Ryan's brother, the man they were betraying with every shared glance, every unspoken word. Ryan answered the call, his voice carefully neutral as he spoke to his brother. Emily watched, her heart in her throat, as the conversation unfolded. When Ryan hung up, his expression was grim. "David wants us all to have dinner together tonight," he said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "He says he has some big news to share." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Do you think he knows?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. Ryan shook his head. "I don't see how he could. We've been so careful. But Emily, we can't keep going like this. It's not fair to anyone, not to David, not to us." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, but what are we supposed to do? I can't imagine my life without you in it, Ryan." But I also can't bear the thought of hurting David like this. Ryan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as she sobbed into his chest. We'll figure it out, he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. Somehow we'll find a way. As they stood there, entwined in their impossible embrace, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the trees nearby. David lowered his phone, his hand shaking as he ended the video recording. His suspicions, harbored since Thanksgiving, were now confirmed in the most painful way possible. He slipped away unnoticed, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just witnessed. The big news he'd planned to share at dinner, his promotion, and the potential move to the West Coast now seemed trivial in comparison to this earth-shattering revelation. As David drove home, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, he wrestled with a torrent of emotions. Rage, betrayal, heartbreak, they all warred for dominance. But beneath it all, a cold, calculating part of his mind was already formulating a plan. A plan that would shock everyone and change their lives forever. Back at the park, Emily and Ryan reluctantly parted ways, each heading home to prepare for the dinner that evening. The weight of their shared secret felt heavier than ever, the specter of discovery looming large. Emily arrived home first, her mind in turmoil. As she mechanically began preparations for dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. She jumped when she heard the front door open, announcing David's return. "Hey, honey," David called out, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "Need any help with dinner?" Emily forced a smile as he entered the kitchen. "No, I've got it under control. How was your day?" David shrugged, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "Oh, the usual. Looking forward to dinner with Ryan tonight. It's been a while since we all got together, hasn't it?" There was something in his tone, a hint of something Emily couldn't quite place. She nodded, focusing on chopping vegetables to avoid meeting his eyes. "Yeah, it has been. Did he mention what the big news is?" David took a long swig of his beer before answering. "Nope. Guess we'll find out soon enough." As the evening progressed and the time for Ryan's arrival drew near, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Emily felt like she was walking on eggshells, hyper-aware of every look, every gesture between her and David. When the doorbell finally rang, Emily nearly jumped out of her skin. David went to answer it, and she heard the brothers' muffled greetings in the hallway. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for what promised to be the most challenging dinner of her life. Ryan entered the kitchen, his eyes immediately finding Emily's. The look they shared was brief but loaded with unspoken emotions. David, coming in behind his brother, didn't miss the exchange. "Well," David said, clapping his hands together with forced enthusiasm, "shall we eat? I'm starving, and I can't wait to share my news with you both." As they settled around the dining table, the air thick with unspoken tensions and hidden agendas, none of them could have predicted the shocking turn the evening was about to take. David's plan, born of heartbreak and betrayal, was about to be set in motion, a plan that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and family bonds in ways they never thought possible. The stage was set for a revelation that would leave Emily and Ryan reeling, forcing them to confront the consequences of their impossible love in the harsh light of reality. As David raised his glass for a toast, his eyes glinting with a mix of pain and determination, the true test of their relationships was about to begin. The soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the blinds of Ryan's modest apartment, casting long shadows across the room. He sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The events of the past few weeks played on repeat in his mind, a torturous loop of stolen moments with Emily and the growing guilt that threatened to consume him. His phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, Emily's name flashing on the screen. Ryan's hand hovered over it, torn between his desperate need to hear her voice and the knowledge that every conversation only deepened their impossible predicament. With a heavy sigh, he let it go to voicemail. "This has to end," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The realization had been building for days, but now, in the quiet of his apartment, it crystallized into an unshakable certainty. He couldn't continue this dance with Emily, not when it threatened to tear apart the very fabric of their family. Ryan stood up abruptly, pacing the length of his small living room. His eyes fell on a framed photo of him and David from their childhood, two brothers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning widely at the camera. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over him. "I'm sorry, David," he whispered to the smiling face of his brother. "I never meant for any of this to happen." With newfound resolve, Ryan grabbed his phone and dialed a number he'd been considering for weeks. "Hey, Jack," he said when his old college roommate answered. "Remember that job offer in Seattle? Is it still open?" The conversation was brief but decisive. By the time Ryan hung up, he had the beginnings of a plan. A clean break, a fresh start on the other side of the country. It wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. As night fell, Ryan found himself driving to Emily and David's house, his heart pounding with each mile that brought him closer to the confrontation he knew he couldn't avoid. He had to tell Emily face to face. He owed her that much. The house was dark when he arrived, save for a single light in the living room. Ryan's knock on the door seemed to echo in the quiet suburban street. Moments later, Emily appeared, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" she asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "David's not home. He's working late again." "I know," Ryan replied, his voice tight. "Can I come in? We need to talk." Emily nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. As soon as the door closed behind them, the air became charged with unspoken tension. They stood in the dimly lit hallway, the physical space between them a chasm neither dared to cross. "Emily," Ryan began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore. We can't do this anymore." She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "What are you saying, Ryan?" He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to say. "I'm leaving, Em. I've accepted a job in Seattle. I'm moving at the end of the month." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Emily's face crumpled, a mix of shock and devastation washing over her features. "You're leaving? Just like that?" Ryan nodded, fighting the urge to take her in his arms and comfort her. "It's the only way. What we're doing, what we feel for each other, it's destroying everything. David, our family, us. We can't keep living like this." Emily's tears flowed freely now, her body shaking with silent sobs. "But I love you, Ryan. I love you so much it hurts. How am I supposed to just let you go?" The raw pain in her voice nearly broke Ryan's resolve. He clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain strong. "I love you too, Emily. God knows I do. But sometimes love isn't enough. We have responsibilities, commitments. David is my brother, and he's your husband. We can't keep betraying him like this." Emily sank to the floor, her back against the wall, looking utterly defeated. Ryan knelt beside her, careful to maintain some distance between them. "I'm so sorry, Em. I wish things were different. I wish we'd met first, that our timing had been better. But we can't change the past. All we can do now is try to salvage what's left of our family." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of their impossible love and the pain of imminent separation pressing down on them. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice hoarse. "What am I supposed to do without you, Ryan? How do I go back to a life where you're not in it?" Ryan's heart ached at the despair in her voice. "You're strong, Emily. Stronger than you know. You'll find a way to move forward, to rebuild your life with David. And in time, maybe we can find a way to be family again, without all this complication." As he stood to leave, Emily grabbed his hand, her touch sending electricity through his body. "Ryan, please, don't go. Not yet. Just hold me one last time." Every fiber of Ryan's being screamed at him to give in, to take her in his arms and never let go. But he knew if he did, his resolve would crumble. With tremendous effort, he gently extracted his hand from hers. "I can't, Em. If I hold you now, I'll never be able to leave. And we both know I have to." The look of utter heartbreak on Emily's face as he walked out the door would haunt Ryan for years to come. As he drove away, his vision blurred with unshed tears. He didn't notice the car parked down the street. David's car. David sat in stunned silence, having witnessed the entire exchange through the living room window. He had come home early, hoping to surprise Emily, only to find his world shattered by the scene that unfolded before him. As he watched Ryan's car disappear into the night, a storm of emotions raged within him: anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and beneath it all, a seed of something darker taking root. Little did any of them know, Ryan's decision to leave, meant to be a selfless act of sacrifice, would set in motion a chain of events that would test the limits of their love, loyalty, and family bonds in ways they could never have imagined. The stage was set for a tragedy that would leave them all forever changed, as David's reaction to this revelation would shock them all to their very core. The oppressive summer heat hung heavy over the city, mirroring the suffocating tension that had settled over the Johnson family in the weeks following Ryan's departure. David sat alone in his dimly lit home office, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. His eyes were fixed on the computer screen, where the video he had captured in Riverside Park played on a loop, a silent testament to his wife's betrayal and his brother's duplicity. A soft knock on the door startled him from his brooding. "David," Emily's voice called tentatively. "Dinner's ready. Are you coming down?" He quickly minimized the video window. "Be right there," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. As David made his way to the dining room, he couldn't help but notice how the house seemed to have lost its warmth. The photos on the walls, once cherished memories, now felt like cruel reminders of happier times. Emily stood by the table, fidgeting nervously with her wedding ring. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of pain through David's heart. "I made your favorite," Emily said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Grilled salmon with that lemon dill sauce you love." David nodded, taking his seat without a word. The silence between them was deafening, filled with unspoken accusations and guilt. As they began to eat, the only sounds were the clinking of cutlery against plates and the distant hum of the air conditioner. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Emily spoke. "David, we need to talk. Things haven't been right between us for a long time, and Is this about Ryan?" David interrupted, his voice low and controlled. Emily froze, her fork clattering to the plate. What?" David raised his eyes to meet hers, his gaze piercing. "I know, Emily. I know everything." The color drained from Emily's face as the implications of his words sank in. "David, we never meant for this to happen. It just Save it." David cut her off, his calm demeanor belying the storm raging within him. He reached for his phone, pulling up the video he had watched countless times. Without a word, he slid it across the table to Emily. As she watched the footage of her and Ryan in the park, Emily's world crumbled around her. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of shame, regret, and relief at finally having the truth out in the open. "How long have you known?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Since that day, I followed you to the park. I had my suspicions for a while, but I needed to see it for myself." Emily buried her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. "David, I'm so sorry. We didn't." "Didn't what, Emily?" David's voice rose for the first time, a hint of the anger he'd been suppressing breaking through. "Didn't sleep together? Didn't plan to leave me? What exactly are you sorry for?" Emily looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "For falling in love with him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For betraying your trust. For hurting you." David stood abruptly, pacing the length of the dining room. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken grievances and shattered dreams. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "I want you to call Ryan," he said, turning to face Emily. "Tell him to come back. We need to settle this once and for all." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "What? David, I don't understand." Ryan's gone. He left to dash. To save our marriage? To be the noble, self-sacrificing brother. David laughed bitterly. Well, it's too late for that. Call him Emily. Tell him if he doesn't come back, I'll make sure everyone knows about your little affair. The threat hung in the air, shocking Emily into silence. This cold, calculating man before her was a far cry from the husband she thought she knew. David, please, she pleaded. Let's just talk about this. We can work it out, go to counseling, anything. But David was already walking out of the room. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at Emily with a mixture of pain and determination in his eyes. Make the call, Emily. It's time we all faced the truth. As David disappeared upstairs, Emily sat frozen at the dining table, the remnants of their uneaten dinner growing cold before her. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, dreading the conversation she was about to have. Across the country, Ryan was just settling into his new life in Seattle when his phone buzzed with Emily's call. His heart raced as he answered, unprepared for the bombshell she was about to drop. Ryan, Emily's voice cracked over the line. You need to come back. David knows everything. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Ryan processed her words. What? How? Emily, what's going on? Through tears, Emily recounted the evening's events, David's ultimatum, and the fear she felt at his uncharacteristic behavior. I don't know what he's planning, Ryan, but I'm scared. Please, you have to come back. Ryan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of their actions crashing down upon him. He had thought his sacrifice would save them all, but instead, it seemed to have set in motion something far worse. I'll be on the next flight, he promised, already dreading the confrontation to come. As Ryan hung up and began hastily packing a bag, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to face the consequences of their actions, to try and salvage what was left of their family. Little did Ryan know, David's reaction to their betrayal would shock them all to their core. As he boarded the red-eye flight back to Boston, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and family in ways none of them could have imagined. The truth was out, the players were assembling, and David's unexpected response to this revelation was about to change their lives forever. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Logan International Airport as Ryan emerged from the terminal, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. The weight of dread sat heavy in his stomach as he hailed a taxi, giving the driver Emily and David's address. As the city streets blurred past the window, Ryan's mind raced with possibilities. What was David planning? How had everything spiraled so far out of control? He had left Boston hoping to mend the fractures in their family, but now it seemed his absence had only deepened the cracks. The taxi pulled up to the familiar suburban home, and Ryan's heart clenched at the sight. How many times had he visited here, laughing with his brother, stealing glances at Emily? Now it felt like entering a war zone. Before he could even raise his hand to knock, the door swung open. David stood there, his face a mask of barely contained emotion. Come in, he said curtly, turning on his heel without waiting for a response. Ryan stepped inside, the tension in the air so thick he could almost taste it. Emily sat on the living room couch, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She looked up as he entered, a mixture of relief and fear crossing her face. Sit down, David commanded, gesturing to an armchair across from Emily. As Ryan complied, David remained standing, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, David spoke, his voice unervingly calm. I've had a lot of time to think about this situation, about what you two have done, about our family, about everything. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but David held up a hand, silencing him. No, you don't get to talk yet. You've both done enough talking behind my back. Now it's my turn. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I love you, Emily. Despite everything, I still love you. And Ryan, you're my brother. We've been through everything together. I can't just throw that away. Emily and Ryan exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the angry confrontation they had been expecting. David continued, his voice taking on an almost manic quality. "So, I've come up with a solution. A way for us all to be happy." The pause that followed was charged with anticipation and dread. When David finally spoke again, his words left them both stunned. "I want Ryan to move back, to live here with us," Emily gasped, while Ryan leaned forward, sure he had misheard. "What are you saying, David?" he asked cautiously. David's eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. "I'm saying that if you two love each other so much, if you can't bear to be apart, then don't be. Move in here, Ryan. Be a part of our family. Our unconventional family." The proposal hung in the air, shocking in its audacity. Emily found her voice first. "David, you can't be serious. This isn't... It's not normal." David finished for her, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Nothing about this situation is normal, Emily, but it's the only way I can see to keep our family together. The only way I don't lose everything." Ryan stood abruptly, his mind reeling. "David, this is insane. You can't possibly think this would work. The jealousy, the resentment, it would destroy us all." David's calm facade cracked slightly, a hint of desperation seeping into his voice. "And what's the alternative, Ryan? I lose my wife and my brother? We tear our family apart? At least this way we have a chance." Emily rose from the couch, moving cautiously towards David. "Honey, please, let's think about this rationally. We can go to counseling, work through our issues. This isn't the answer." But David stepped away from her, his eyes wild. "This is the only answer. Don't you see? It's this or nothing. I can't lose you both." Ryan watched his brother, a sinking feeling in his gut. He recognized the signs, the manic energy, the desperate grasping at straws. David was a man on the edge, pushed to his breaking point by their betrayal. Taking a deep breath, Ryan made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. "Okay, David," he said softly. "If this is what you want, if this is what you need to heal, then I'll do it. I'll move back." Emily whirled to face him, shock and disbelief etched across her features. "Ryan, no. You can't be serious. This isn't a solution. It's madness." But Ryan held up a hand, silencing her protests. "Emily, we did this. We caused this pain. If there's even a chance this could help David, help our family, don't we owe it to him to try?" David's face lit up with a mixture of relief and triumph. "You see, Emily, this can work. We can make this work." As Emily looked between the two brothers, she felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't a solution, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. But faced with David's fragile mental state and Ryan's unexpected acquiescence, she found herself nodding slowly. "All right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We'll try." As David pulled them both into an awkward embrace, Emily's eyes met Ryan's over his shoulder. The look they shared was one of trepidation and unspoken understanding. They had agreed to this impossible arrangement, but at what cost? Little did they know, David's shocking proposal was just the beginning. The days and weeks to come would test the limits of their love, loyalty, and sanity in ways they could never have imagined. As the three of them stood there, locked in that uncomfortable embrace, the stage was set for a domestic experiment that would either save their family or destroy it completely. The true test of their relationships was about to begin, and none of them were prepared for the emotional roller coaster that lay ahead. The summer heat had given way to a crisp autumn chill, but inside the Johnson household, the atmosphere remained suffocatingly tense. It had been 2 months since Ryan had moved in, and the strain of their unconventional living arrangement was beginning to show on all of them. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into his coffee mug. The sound of Emily and David's muffled argument drifted down from upstairs, a now familiar soundtrack to their mornings. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, wondering for the 1,000th time if he had made the right choice in agreeing to this madness. The arguing upstairs suddenly ceased, followed by the sound of a door slamming. Moments later, Emily appeared in the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "Hey," Ryan said softly, pushing a fresh mug of coffee towards her. Emily accepted it gratefully, collapsing into the chair across from him. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice hoarse from crying. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Finally, Ryan spoke. "This isn't working, is it?" Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes again. "It's killing us, Ryan. All of us. David. He's not the man I married anymore. And you and I." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Ryan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The simple touch sent a jolt through both of them, a reminder of the feelings they had tried so hard to suppress. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I hoped we could make this work somehow, for David's sake. But we're just prolonging the inevitable, aren't we?" Emily nodded, squeezing his hand. "What are we going to do?" Before Ryan could respond, David's voice cut through the kitchen. "Well, isn't this cozy?" They jumped apart, guilty expressions flashing across their faces. David stood in the doorway, his eyes hard and cold as he surveyed the scene before him. "David," Emily began, her voice pleading. "We were just Save it," David snapped, his calm facade crumbling. "I'm not blind. I see the way you two look at each other. This whole arrangement, it was a mistake." Ryan stood slowly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "David, brother, please, let's talk about this rationally." But David wasn't listening. Months of pent-up anger, jealousy, and hurt came pouring out. "Rationally? There's nothing rational about this situation. Ryan, I invited you into my home, tried to salvage what was left of our family, and this is how you repay me." Emily stepped between the brothers, her voice trembling but determined. "David, stop. This isn't Ryan's fault. It's mine. I'm the one who fell in love with him." The admission hung in the air, shocking all three of them into silence. It was the first time any of them had said it out loud since this nightmare began. David staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. You love him?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, David. I never meant for this to happen. I tried to fight it, we both did. But what?" David roared, his composure finally shattering completely. "But you couldn't help yourselves? But your love was too strong." He laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of any humor. "Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us?" Ryan moved to stand beside Emily, his presence both a comfort and a statement. "David, we never wanted to hurt you. That's why I left, why we tried to make this work. But we can't keep living like this. It's destroying all of us." David's eyes darted between them, a storm of emotions playing across his face. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out physically. But then, something in him seemed to deflate. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking older and more worn than they had ever seen him. "So what now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Where do we go from here?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was Ryan who finally broke it, his voice steady and resolved. "I'll leave. For good this time. No contact, no coming back. It's the only way to give you both a chance to heal, to rebuild." Emily turned to him, shock and pain etched across her features. "Ryan, no. You can't dash." But Ryan held up a hand, silencing her protest. "It's the only way, Em. We both know it." David looked up at his brother, a mix of gratitude and resentment in his eyes. "And you'll stay away? For real this time?" Ryan nodded solemnly. "You have my word. I'll move across the country if I have to. You'll never have to see or hear from me again." The finality of his words hung heavy in the air. Emily let out a choked sob, torn between the love she felt for Ryan and the guilt of what they had done to David. David stood slowly, extending his hand to Ryan. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, either of you, but it's a start." As the brothers shook hands, Emily watched through tear-filled eyes, realizing that this was truly the end. The love she had found with Ryan, the future she had dared to imagine, was slipping away before her eyes. Ryan turned to her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Goodbye, Emily," he said softly, leaning in to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Be happy. That's all I want for both of you." With that, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and out of their lives. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the suddenly quiet home, a final punctuation mark on this chapter of their lives. Emily and David stood in the kitchen, the space between them vast and uncertain. They had survived the storm, but at what cost? As they looked at each other, both wondered if there was anything left to salvage from the wreckage of their marriage. Outside, Ryan climbed into his car, his heart heavy with the weight of his sacrifice. As he drove away from the only family he had ever known, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. But deep down, he knew it was the only way to give them all a chance at healing, at finding peace. Little did any of them know, fate had one final, cruel twist in store, a tragedy that would shake the very foundations of their world and test the limits of their newfound resolution. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of the approaching winter as Ryan's car sped down the interstate, leaving Seattle in his rearview mirror. It had been just over a month since he'd made the painful decision to leave Boston, to remove himself entirely from Emily and David's lives. The weight of his sacrifice sat heavy on his shoulders, but he clung to the hope that his absence would allow his brother and the woman he loved to heal and rebuild their lives. Ryan's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, displaying a text from his new boss. He glanced at it briefly, noting the request for him to come into the office early the next day for an important meeting. Sighing, he refocused on the road, determined to make good on this fresh start. As he rounded a bend, the screech of tires and the blinding glare of headlights filled his vision. Time seemed to slow as Ryan realized what was happening. A truck had jackknifed it across the lanes ahead, causing a chain reaction of collisions. He slammed on his brakes, desperately trying to avoid the chaos unfolding before him. In that moment, as metal crunched and glass shattered, Ryan's thoughts flew to Emily and David. A wave of regret washed over him, regret for the pain he'd caused, for the words left unsaid, for the relationships left in tatters. As his car spun out of control, he closed his eyes, whispering a silent prayer for forgiveness and protection for those he loved. Miles away, in Boston, Emily jolted awake from a fitful sleep, a sense of unexplainable dread settling over her. She glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Beside her, David stirred but didn't wake. The tension between them had eased somewhat in the weeks since Ryan's departure, but a chasm of unspoken words and suppressed emotions still separated them. Unable to shake her feeling of unease, Emily slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen. As she waited for the kettle to boil, her gaze fell on a family photo hanging on the fridge. Her, David, and Ryan at a summer barbecue years ago, all smiles and laughter. How had they gone from that to this? The shrill ring of the phone cut through the pre-dawn silence, making Emily jump. With trembling hands, she answered, "Hello, Mrs. Johnson?" An unfamiliar voice asked. "This is Officer Martinez from the Seattle Police Department. I'm calling about your brother-in-law, Ryan Johnson." Emily's blood ran cold. What about Ryan?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to inform you," the officer continued, his voice grave, "but there's been an accident. Mr. Johnson was involved in a multi-car pileup on the highway early this morning. He didn't make it. I'm so sorry for your loss." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Emily struggled to process the officer's words. Ryan, gone? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. Just weeks ago, he had stood in this very kitchen, alive and breathing. And now, "Emily?" David's voice called from the doorway, concern etched across his face. "What's wrong?" She turned to him, the phone slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. "It's Ryan," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. He's gone, David. There was an accident." David stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept the words he'd just heard. In 3 quick strides, he crossed the kitchen and gathered Emily in his arms, his own tears beginning to fall. As the reality of Ryan's death washed over them, Emily and David clung to each other, united in their grief. All the anger, the jealousy, the hurt of the past months seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a crushing wave of loss and regret. "The last thing we did was send him away," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "We never got to make things right." David tightened his hold on her, his chest tight with emotion. "I know," he murmured. "God, I know." As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the kitchen window, Emily and David remained locked in their embrace. The tragedy of Ryan's death had shattered the walls of resentment and hurt that had grown between them, forcing them to confront the love and family bonds that still lingered beneath the pain. In the days that followed, as they went through the motions of arranging the funeral and notifying family and friends, Emily and David found themselves gravitating towards each other, seeking comfort in shared memories and mutual understanding. The loss of Ryan had created a void in both their lives, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of forgiveness. At the funeral, standing side by side as they listened to the eulogies, David reached out and took Emily's hand in his. She looked up at him, surprised by the gesture, and saw his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and something else, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or the first tentative steps towards healing. As they lowered Ryan's casket into the ground, Emily and David held onto each other, their shared sorrow a powerful force drawing them back together. In that moment, surrounded by the tangible evidence of life's impermanence, they both silently vowed to honor Ryan's memory by fighting for the family he had sacrificed everything to protect. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but as they left the cemetery that day, hand in hand, there was a sense that perhaps, out of this tragedy, they might find a way to rebuild what had been broken, not just for themselves, but for Ryan, whose final, unintended gift had been to remind them of the true meaning of family and forgiveness. The harsh winter had finally loosened its grip on Boston, giving way to the first tentative signs of spring. It had been 6 months since Ryan's tragic passing, and the Johnson household was slowly emerging from the depths of grief that had engulfed it. Emily stood in the backyard, watching as the first crocuses pushed through the thawing earth. The sight of new life emerging after the long, dark winter struck a chord within her, a metaphor for the journey she and David had been on. David's voice called softly from the back door. "You ready?" She turned to face him, nodding silently. Today was the day they had both been dreading and longing for, the day they would finally have the conversation they'd been avoiding for months. They settled in the living room, the space between them on the couch a physical representation of the emotional distance they still needed to bridge. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, David broke the silence. "I've been seeing Dr. Matthews," he said, referring to the therapist he'd started visiting shortly after Ryan's funeral. "She's been helping me work through everything." Emily nodded, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "That's good, David. I'm glad you're getting help." Another pause, longer this time. Then David spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to tell you something, Em. Something I should have said months ago." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for how I handled everything, for trying to control you and Ryan, for my anger, for not being able to see past my own pain." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, David," she whispered. "No, let me finish," he said gently. "I was hurt, yes, betrayed, but I realize now that I played a part in driving you away. I wasn't the husband you needed, the partner you deserved, and instead of facing that, I lashed out. I tried to hold on to you and Ryan in the worst way possible." Emily reached out, taking David's hand in hers. "I'm sorry too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the pain I caused you, for betraying your trust, for not being honest about my feelings for Ryan from the start." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, each lost in their own thoughts. "I miss him," Emily said finally, a tear sliding down her cheek. "Every day. And I feel so guilty because I know my feelings for him hurt you so deeply." David nodded, his own eyes glistening. "I miss him too. He was my brother, Em. Despite everything, I loved him. And now," his voice broke, Now I'll never get the chance to tell him that. To make things right. Emily shifted closer, wrapping her arms around David. They held each other, sharing in their grief and regret. What do we do now? Emily asked softly, her head resting on David's shoulder. David was quiet for a moment, considering. I think we honor Ryan's memory by trying to be better. By working on us if that's what you want. He sacrificed so much for this family. We owe it to him to try. Emily pulled back slightly, looking into David's eyes. Is that what you want? To try again? David nodded slowly. It is. I love you, Em. Despite everything, that's never changed. But I know we have a long way to go. We've both hurt each other so much. I love you too, Emily said, surprising herself with the truth of the words. The love she felt for David was different from what she'd felt for Ryan, but it was no less real. And you're right, we have a lot of work to do. But I want to try. They spent the rest of the day talking, really talking. For the first time in what felt like years, they discussed their fears, their hopes, the issues that had driven them apart. It wasn't easy. There were tears, raised voices, moments of frustration. But beneath it all was a commitment to honesty and a shared desire to heal. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Emily and David found themselves back in the kitchen where so much of their story had unfolded. David was making tea, a simple act of care that spoke volumes about their progress. Do you think Ryan would be happy? Emily asked, echoing a question she'd asked months before. Seeing us like this, trying to make it work? David handed her a steaming mug, a small smile on his face. I do. I think this is what he wanted all along, for us to find our way back to each other, to heal. Emily nodded, taking a sip of her tea. I like to think he's watching over us somehow, guiding us. Maybe he is, David said softly. He raised his mug slightly. To Ryan, brother, friend, and in his own way, the one who saved our family. Emily clinked her mug against his. To Ryan, she echoed, as they stood there in the fading light, sipping their tea in comfortable silence. Both Emily and David felt a sense of peace they hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was still long, and they knew there would be challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, they faced the future together, united in their love for each other and in the memory of the man who had sacrificed everything for their happiness. The tragedy that had torn them apart had also, in its own way, brought them back together. And in that bittersweet reality, they found hope for a new beginning, a chance to honor Ryan's memory by building the loving, honest relationship he had always wanted for them. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.